protest shouting at tourists walking down the street. The damage that it's done to the image of the islands and the tourist industry is massive, because obviously, yes, there has been this protest and people are seeing it and saying, should we go elsewhere?
What sort of model will they follow in the future?
They want less tourist numbers, more sustainable tourism, higher income tourism, so the knock-on effect is that the locals and residents benefit from it as well, not just, if you like, the hotel owners or the companies that own the hotels, that most of them aren't even based in the islands. And I wouldn't try and tell anyone not to come, because it's a fantastic place to have a holiday, enjoy yourself. But it doesn't have to be done on the cheap.
And this backlash, the strength of feeling from locals, it is significant.
It's significant towards the authorities, yes. The only way they can get heard is by trying to highlight or damage the one thing that makes the economy tick, which is tourism.
I've been focusing on the resistance from locals in European holiday destinations, many wishing we were not there. But this trend is happening around the world, in Bali, in Miami, the South Pacific, Kenya and Kyoto. The lesson is surely, yes, tourism can create jobs, maintain a local economy and boost GDP. But unchecked, it can do so to the detriment of many in the local community, disrupting their access to basic resources and services. And as far as we tourists are concerned, some would say the onus falls on us to appreciate that we're guests in someone else's home when we travel. But I am keen to find out what more we can do to improve the lot of host communities, and maybe to balance that worrying caricature of today's tourists as selfie-taking narcissists. So next week, we're looking at different models for tourism, which might help protect local residents. We meet two very different people who decided to give up flying altogether as a reaction to aviation's contribution to global warming. And following their lead, instead of taking the plane, I'll be taking the night train to Vienna. Sounds romantic, eh? Do I get any sleep? And is it worth it?
The Tourist Trap was presented by Rajan Dattar. The producer was Bob Howard. And Rajan returns at the same time next week. You know those times when you just can't tear yourself away from something great on Radio 4?
Well, at times people come up to me if I'm at home and I'm like, here we go, they'll say something nice about whatever film or artist come out. Can I just say it?
With most smart speakers, you can now ask BBC Sounds to pause, rewind and restart live radio.
Can I just say it? Your dad delivered me and my sister, and my mum always talks about how much she fancied your dad.
So you never have to miss another minute. To get started, just say, ask BBC Sounds. Now, as part of the BBC's mental health and wellbeing focus throughout May, Tuppence Middleton reads Caroline Crampton's History of Hypochondria, a body made of glass, which draws together cultural history and personal memoir. Today, the people made of glass. It's very bright in the deserted bathroom at work. The rhythms of the ritual are deeply ingrained. Lean forward, closer to the mirror, one hand to pull my shirt away from my left collarbone, the other to poke and prod the shadow I saw there. Blotchy redness is rising out of my collar and climbing up my throat. I know the pattern. On bad days, when I'm tired and slow, the sensation of something soft and yet hard at the same time, catching on the usually smooth mechanism of our pivoting neck. I know the pattern, but can still be stuck in it. You know it's not real, but this time it might be real. What my fingers are looking for is evidence of a lump. Tumours have a certain texture, I've learned. When I found one in this part of my neck before, nearly a decade ago, I could roll it between my fingers. While I'm still poking and staring, my thoughts start to accelerate. If there really is something growing in my neck, I will have to deliver the bad news to my husband, my parents, parents, my sister, my friends. Give up my work, manage with less money, yet somehow pay someone else to walk my dog when I'm too weak to do it. Does anyone know the password for my computer? And if not, how will they get into my email after I'm dead? I haven't stopped probing my neck all the while, my fingers on autopilot. But I'm also now wondering what is involved in making a digital will. I think about all the doctors I've seen in the past, about all the kind efforts to put my mind at ease, about the symptoms that I've described again and again, only to be told when tests come back negative that I should lose a bit of weight or try to lower my stress levels. You are allowed to think it. I can hear you thinking it. I am a hypochondriac. The fear that there is something wrong with me, that I am sick, is always with me. It wasn't always this way. For the first 16 years of my life, I was gloriously unaware of my own state of health. The before and after moment came when I was 17. I was applying to university. A winter of feeling run down culminated in my being diagnosed with Hodgkin's lymphoma, a type of blood cancer. After months of treatment, I was given the all clear and went off to university as planned. But then, during my first year, when I was 18, I found a lump in my neck that turned out to be a return of the cancer. I required more chemotherapy, a stem cell transplant, and a weeks-long stay on an isolation ward. Years of monitoring and testing followed before I was eventually declared cured at the age of 22. The medical staff who had seen me through all of this waved me off with smiles, joking that they hoped never to see me again. Once I made it to 5 years after the end of treatment, the likelihood of my getting cancer again had become about the same as for the rest of the population. My body and my life, they said, were cancer-free. But I am not free. Hypochondria is as slippery and elusive a term as the condition it tries to encompass. It dwells in contradictions, a perceived disease of the body that exists only in the mind. There is a vast and bewildering literature. Hippocrates used the word in the 5th century BCE, and it's been a subject for study and discussion through every era since. But after centuries of work and acres of text, the question of what hypochondria is remains anything but settled. We tend to think of hypochondria as shorthand for an illness that's all in your head, but the word we use today was born of a medieval term for an area of the abdomen. In the Greek of Hippocrates, hypo meant under, and chondros denoted the cartilage of the sternum. With these two parts combined, this word was adopted into Latin and then arrived in English in the 15th century. For hundreds of years, hypochondria, referring to the two mirrored sections of the torso, was merely a geographical term used to describe where a pain was located. But then something changed. By the 17th century, it had come to denote a mysterious and melancholy condition thought to result from an imbalance in the organs of these regions. Gradually, any illness without a detectable cause began to be referred to as hypochondria. In my experience, medical professionals today tend to default to the term health anxiety, which seems to blend in well with the current practical vocabulary of mental health, while in conversation, most people still say hypochondria. I like the word. It feels rooted in a history and a tradition that connects sufferers stretching back over 2,000 years. My status as a former cancer patient is both an enormous privilege and a perpetual curse. It means that I survive and that my symptoms are always investigated thoroughly. But it also means that I've been encouraged by doctors to pay close attention to how I feel, in case I can pick up on an early warning sign of a recurrence. And it feels at times like having cancer for real was the training I went through so that I could have a dozen other illnesses in my imagination. I am now very good at being unwell. I've had a lot of practice. The longer I've lived with this, the more I've become convinced that diagnosable illness and hypochondria can coexist. Most people have some legitimate concern about at least one aspect of their health, whether it's a prior condition, a family history, or an environmental factor. soon when this justifiable anxiety expands well beyond the boundaries of the verifiable health concern. For example, when someone with a chronic back injury becomes convinced that they have mouth cancer. Everyone has their niggling doubts, that internal voice that says, "Hey." The hypochondriacs are just listening up for that much more clearly. Everything about my situation, the hypochondriac cancer survivor, feels quixotic and a bit silly. It took being cured of a life-threatening illness for me to become fixated on the idea that I might be sick. Some of you hearing this now will probably think less of me in some private, secret way for sharing this part of myself. I used to worry about that, but now I just think, I'm glad you don't know whether this is. In the 2nd century CE, the Greek physician Galen of Pergamon noted the existence of a peculiar condition, seemingly all in the patient's mind but felt in the body. As he said, fears always accompany melancholic people. For instance, one person thinks that he is a piece of pottery, so that he avoids those who approach him in order not to be broken. There are references to this phenomenon in other physicians' accounts too. Rufus of Ephesus, another 2nd century physician, suggests that patients of a cold, dry disposition are more likely to fall prey to the idea that they are made of a brittle clay, and the notion is later picked up enthusiastically by Critias of Amida, a Byzantine physician of the 5th and 6th centuries. He noted that, along with believing that one had been transformed into a chicken or being mortally afraid that the sky was about to fall, this transformation into pottery remained in the first rank of unexplained delusions. Then, in the late 14th century, this preoccupation with earthenware abruptly changed. The patients of this era shared many of the same anxieties, feeling fragile and extremely brittle, but they no longer believed their flesh had been transformed into baked clay, but that it had become a new material, glass. Although humans have been working with glass in various ways for thousands of years, it wasn't until the method known as the crown glass process was perfected in the late 13th century Venice that glassmaking became a widespread trade in Europe. And as people grew familiar with it, those inclined towards delusions of fragility and impermanence were drawn to the symbolic potential of glass. What these people believed afflicted them was not a recognizable illness, but a wholesale bodily transformation into a material utterly unlike human flesh. Some believed that they had assumed the form of an oil lamp or a jar, while in rare cases, the entire substance of the person was transformed into glass. Glass limbs were reported, but glass hearts and heads were far more common. The places where the mind and body meet, where it feels like the self resides, seem to be the most susceptible. One possibly exaggerated report from the early 17th century by a French royal physician concerned a Parisian glassmaker who suffered from a form of the delusion focused on the buttocks. He supposedly went around with a small cushion fastened to his behind at all times in case they broke when he sat down. He was apparently cured by a doctor who beat him severely until he accepted that it was flesh which hurt so badly, and that he hadn't broken. The first person who believed themselves to be entirely made of glass was the French King Charles VI, or at least as far as we know, the delusions of less important people are not so well documented. In 1392, during a military campaign in the northwest of his kingdom, the 24-year-old Charles was gripped by a mania, and according to those around him, suddenly transformed into a completely different person. He started talking nonsense, wouldn't respond to reason, and tried to attack his own soldiers. His courtiers restrained him and took him back to Paris, where his ravings coalesced around a specific fear. He couldn't bear to be touched, he said, because he was made of glass and could shatter on contact. He had his clothing reinforced with iron rods and always moved with caution because a collision could break him apart. His condition led to a regency battle and then a civil war between armies led by his brothers and his wife. In a sense, the French state shattered because its monarch believed he was made of glass. The preoccupation with glass endured for as long as the material was considered new and special, peaking in the late 17th century and then diminishing as it became commonplace. It hadn't vanished entirely. A case of full-blown glass delusion was recorded in the Netherlands as recently as 1964. This final glass man had different worries from his predecessors. He wasn't concerned that he would break, but rather that he was completely transparent and so invisible. He explained his condition by directing his doctor's attention to a nearby window, saying, "That's me. I'm there and I'm not there, like the glass in the window." In its modern incarnation, the hypochondriac idea of a body made of glass is not only a symptom of anxiety, it also holds out the possibility of a cure. Through scans and blood tests, biopsies and surgery, X-rays and genome analysis, the body is being rendered increasingly transparent to medical and scientific knowledge. And yet, with this transparency comes an awareness of the million minute things that need to function well for us to be healthy, and the ease with which any of them could fail. The more I've learned about the glass people of centuries past, the more I've become convinced that their affliction is the perfect analogue for beginning to understand an ancient condition that remakes itself anew for every age. I am pulling on the fragile thread as it weaves through every age of medical progress. Gently, tenderly, I will hold the body made of glass to the light and watch it shine.
The Body Made of Glass, A History of Hypochondria by Caroline Crampton was read by Tuppence Middleton. The book was abridged and produced by Elizabeth Burke and Heather Dempsey and is a Loftus Media production for Radio 4.
Whole of the channel, and as far as you could see, nothing but ships.
On June the 6th, 1944, around 7,000 boats carried more than 130,000 troops to 5 beaches in France.
And I tell the truth, I was frightened to death.
It changed the course of history.
You know, we had a job to do and we get on with it.
80 years on, we hear the real stories of D-Day from those who survived it.
It was carnage.
D-Day, The Last Voices, presented by me, Annie O'Connell. Next Monday to Friday morning at 11:45, Radio 4 and BBC Sound.
BBC News next Monday. Campaigners are eagerly awaiting the final report of the 7-year Abercrombie anti-infected blood scandal, which is widely considered to be the biggest treatment disaster in the history of the NHS. Around 3,000 people were infected with HIV or hepatitis C after being given contaminated blood between the 1970s and early 90s. Correspondent Eddie Price, who's outside the inquiry in South London, says it's not just about compensation.
I think the really important bit that we should get this afternoon will be the reaction from Parliament. We're expecting a full and formal apology from the government, which is
says Iran is already preparing for Mr. Raisi's successor.
Power has now transferred to the Iranian Vice President, Mohammad Mokhtar. He, as well as the head of the judiciary and the Speaker of the Parliament, are charged with organising early presidential elections in Iran. Those have to be held within the next 50 days. This is an absolutely critical moment for Iran's ruling conservatives, the hardliners. Their focus now will be to send a message of continuity, of stability of the Islamic Republic.
A hearing is taking place at the High Court in London, where judges are expected to make their final decision on whether to allow